My name is Becky White. I'm on our pastoral team here. Specifically, I do our pastoral counseling. And I'm so glad to be here at the Huntington Drive campus with you today. This is an amazing place to do church. It's where we house our offices, and so we're here all the time. And it's incredible. One time I was walking through this space, and there was a gal that was just sitting in the back during the week. And I asked her if she's okay, and she was actually weeping. And she said, I came here this morning because it's the last place I heard and felt God's presence, and I just wanted to be here. And it was just so good to recognize God works in geographical spaces to make us know that we're not alone. And that's what Martha shared with us. When we're in pain, we often isolate. But to know that not only is God here on a Sunday morning at 11 a.m., He's here. He's at your house too. But sometimes it's great to know that you can have a community that worships together. So glad to be a part of that this morning. So I have 4 sons, all of whom are, several are married, which means I have a couple daughters. And it's cool because daughters talk to you. It's so great. And they talk about, like, your sons, which is your favorite topic ever. So one of my sons is still dating, and my 2 daughters-in-law talk to her, the girl he's dating, which means I get information prior to an engagement, which is usually when you hear it from your sons. Oh yeah, I met this girl and we're gonna get married. So I'm thankful for these beautiful daughters-in-law. But years ago, my oldest son, who's now almost 30, was a huge and remains a huge UCLA fan, which means you guys, thank you. We are an amazing 6-6 this year. Mediocre enough to go to a terrible bowl game, which is what my Christmas wish would be, that we would have a new tradition and win a bowl game. But Trevor is long-suffering. He has all the fruit of the Spirit, which is developed through his UCLA fandom. So when he was young, so keep in mind, 3 of my boys are triplets. So Trevor would hide out from them all he could. And when he was about 8 years old, he used to sit at the kitchen table and he would take a big piece of construction paper and he would draw plays out, like X's and O's. So you have to know his dad and I were athletes and we were also coaches. So he was used to the strategy side of the game. So X's and O's, and he wouldn't just leave them on the line. He would draw where they'd go after the ball was snapped. And then he would draw the players that were in the play on the outside of his page, with their helmets, of course, with the exact face mask they wore and their number. And so one day when he's doing this, after homework, of course, because we had priorities, and he's doing this, he's drawing it out, and he drew his X's and O's and his plays, and he just drew a ton of them on the page. I said, well, Trevor, where are the little guys that you draw around it? He goes, no, Mom, this paper's going to Coach Bob Toledo at UCLA because they need some new plays. And so we folded that baby up, put it in the mail, Coach Toledo, UCLA football. We're sitting in the end zone against our arch rival, USC, right? If you're a UCLA fan, you don't like USC. You hate USC. Your 2 favorite teams are UCLA and whoever is playing USC. And on Facebook, I'm such a troll that all my friends who are USC fans, I put the mascot of the other team they're playing on their page, just to bug them. So we're sitting there in the end zone at the Coliseum watching UCLA play USC. It's almost halftime, and they run a sweep to the right, and Trevor's like, Mom, that was my play. They used my play to score that touchdown. And so he's like yelling at the team, like, way to go, way to run that play, as they're running out into the tunnel. And so not the next week, we get a letter from Coach Toledo saying, Trevor, we're using all your plays, buddy. We're scoring on those plays. They're the best, right? You guys are all going to be UCLA fans. So that year we beat USC. It was a bit of an anomaly, and so we're still celebrating. I think it was our last win over them. We won that game, which meant we were going to the Rose Bowl, which is an amazing feat, and it had only happened like when the stars line up, and it only happens one time in Trevor's lifetime, and he's this 8-year-old boy, and so he comes to us and he says, Mom, all I want for Christmas is a Rose Bowl ticket. And I said, okay, well, Trev, we only get 2. So we had season tickets, which means you had the opportunity to buy as many Rose Bowl tickets as you have season tickets. However, you don't sit in your regular seat and you pay $5 million for each of those tickets. But we were going to buy 2 tickets, but we tried everything. We couldn't get another ticket, and he kept telling us, Mom, that's really all I want. And I try to temper his, like, we're not surprising you on this, buddy. We really can't get you one. But then I started thinking as Christmas got closer, I cannot imagine my 8-year-old kid sitting at home and me going and enjoying that game at all. So I thought, I'm going to give him my ticket. So I decided to do it in his stocking. And our stockings are like this. You get a pair of socks, an orange, and like enough gummy snacks to put in your lunch for all of January. So it's kind of a low expectation kind of a moment to open stockings at our house. But I decided to put the ticket in his stocking. And the ticket is like as big as a stocking. It's this beautiful memorial ticket. And so he's opening a stocking, and remember the bar is set pretty low on that. Opening it, all of a sudden he gets this ticket. And my boys are very enthusiastic. I have always prayed for them to have soft hearts like mine, which means we had a loud house because everyone cares a ton about what they care about. And this was a good moment because he was very excited. So he began running around the house, so excited, like, I got a ticket. And so finally he plops down out of exhaustion next to me. And he looks at me and says, Mom, how did you get it? And I said, it was my ticket. And the look of joy on his face changed so quickly to this incredible look of gratitude and appreciation because he recognized that it wasn't just that he was going to enjoy the game. Someone had given it to him. And when I think about that moment, I think that's what God intended with this gift of coming near to us. He intended for us to have joy. But that joy is to shift to gratitude as we acknowledge what this gift means to us. We acknowledge it's not just that he left heaven, which we're not going to recognize this side of heaven, how great that is, that he would leave heaven to go be born in a manger. It's about him coming to live a life and sacrificially giving us something we couldn't have earned on our own. That's what Advent is. And that's what we invite you into, to recognize that Christmas has a name. I love the Apostle Paul. He went throughout the whole known world on missionary journeys. And at one point, he went to Greece, in the city of Athens. Keep in mind the history. Greek was the power. They took over in the Daniel reign, right after the Assyrian, Phoenician era. The Greeks took over, and then Rome took over. So by the time Paul was going around everywhere, Rome was the king and power of the whole world. But Athens was still a place of incredible thought, philosophy, and just like we think of Socrates and Plato, they used to kind of meet in the town square. So Paul got to Athens, and he is going to go to the synagogue, but before that, he actually tours the city. And in Acts 17, he joins the guys, the really thinkers and philosophers at the main city square, and he says, I have walked through your city, and I have seen your objects of worship. And I saw one statue that was made to an unknown God. And I want to tell you, he has a name. But before Paul told them his name, he said, in him you have lived, moved, and breathed, and found your meaning. And it was Jesus. We need to recognize that this God was never far away. He came near in the form of a baby. But he was in Genesis 1, when the Spirit was hovering over the unformed surfaces of the earth. He has been with us the entire time. And that is a gift for us to know. That is a gift for us to understand, and that gift should not ever stay with us. You know, when my triplets were about almost 2 years old, I remember it because this moment was cemented in my mind. They all had cribs. They were in one big room, and they had cribs at each wall because, you know, we had to have them far apart because they were really creative. And so I watched one day as Cameron, one of my boys, literally stood on his hands and began to walk up the back of the crib with his feet until he reached the sidebar. And he hung his feet over, and he rolled up and hopped out. I was horrified. And I looked, and he just started jumping around with laughing because he was free. And I thought, well, maybe his brothers are asleep. But no, they were on their cribs, like looking out, watching every move he made. So I put him back in, thinking it was maybe just a lucky try. But he was out within 30 seconds, and so were his brothers. Because when you have something that good, you do not keep it to yourself. You demonstrate that this is how to get free. We are going to be free now the rest of our lives. So I went to the doctor, and I was like, Doctor, please tell me that I can put like a cage over the top, that it's like legal to do that. He says, no, Becky, put their crib mattresses on the floor, put up a gate. I said, no, they get over a gate. They're like Together, one mind, it's devious. They would get on each other's shoulders and back. And he said, well, then put up a board big enough that they can't do that. I said, okay. So literally, we put a piece of plywood in that was about this tall on the door, and we would just lift it up, and they would scurry out of the room like the livestock they were. And that was how we had sanity until they started driving. When you have something that great, you do not keep it to yourselves, which is the cool thing about why we have this today. Because these words are alive, and because they mattered enough for people to not only maintain them, but to get them to a place where we could understand this truth. And so when we see a group of names like we do in Matthew 1, which is where we're going to camp out today, when we see a list of names, what we have to think about those guys is they figured out how to get out of the crib. And they figured out what freedom was like. And freedom was truly theirs in the presence of God. They recognized that God was not only with them, but with them in the sense that he was present with them, but he was also for them. And he was for a group of people who were not always for God. What I love about the list in Matthew, and we will not read them all because some of the names are really hard to say. But what I love about that list is it's an improbable list of people. Some people on that list you'd expect, they were kings. They were kind of born to kings, and so that would just be the family line. But there's a few people in that list, namely 4 women that are listed there, that should have never been in this list. In fact, if you go strictly by the law, they wouldn't belong in this list because this list starts with Abraham and it ends with Jesus. It's the line of Christ. So when you look at some of the people in this list and you know how they live their lives, you think, wow, maybe they didn't belong in this list. But I think they're there for us to recognize that these guys understood who God was. In some form or another, they were able to know how to share that with someone else. It was a contagious kind of relationship that they had with God. I love the women specifically in this list. First one is Tamar. She slept with her father-in-law to have twin boys, probably had bigger problems with them than their cribs. But the next woman in this list was Rahab. She was a prostitute in a foreign land, Jericho, and she helped the spies that came in before they marched around the city and destroyed their walls. The next woman is Ruth, also a foreigner. You have to know it was against the law, Israel's law, for anyone in Israel to marry a foreigner. These women didn't just marry Israeli Jewish men, they ended up in the line of Christ. And the last one is Bathsheba, the wife of another man who David called in and had a son through her, through an incredible, in fact, his deepest sin. Those are the 4 women listed here. It's incredible. It's incredible who God chose. It's incredible who he didn't choose. God worked in the lives of these men and women just like he works in our lives. He worked through wins. He worked through losses. He worked through moments of discouragement. He worked through moments of utter bliss. Because God is present in all of those kinds of moments, and they all count. God is sovereign. We've talked about that in Daniel. That means he controls even our own choices, the choices of others, even what he allows in our life. He controls it to bring about his purposes. Don't you know that when you're talking about a list like that, God had his fingerprints on every single person. He chose who was there and he chose who wasn't there. There were millions and millions of people that lived during these generations of time. But God pulled aside these people and he dealt with them in unique ways. The word Immanuel doesn't just show up in Matthew 1, where we'll read it in a minute. It shows up to begin with in Isaiah. It shows up to begin with in a space where God is talking to a king named Ahaz. He's one of the guys on this page. And when he talks to this king, he's talking to a king who is tired and exhausted and who has not always been obedient to God. But he tells this king, as he's leading his troops out against their brothers to the north and against 2 very vicious kings, God sends a prophet to King Ahaz, and he says, those kings you're going up against today, they're going to be dead and gone and forgotten when I will send my son through a virgin, and he will be called Immanuel. Twice he gives the promise of Immanuel to this tired, weary king, just to let him know, I've got a plan. It's bigger than you, but you're a part of it. And that is encouraging for us to know. It matters to us that God has a purpose for our lives, but we're part of that purpose. And that gives us hope. I remember with one of my sons, just really struggled. We would go to that passage in Psalms every night before he went to bed, and we would say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I think we said that for about a dozen years before he ever believed it was true. But that's the truth of who you are. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. And when God came near, he didn't just come near a nation. He didn't just come near a church. He came near individual people, and that's why he listed them, because they matter. So when you see a list of people, you might want to skip over it, but it's kind of fun if you would read it, and read it silently so that you could pretend the names you pronounce were perfect. But people matter to God, individual people, but people that he would work in and then work through. Not only do people matter to God, but times matter to God as well. Matthew 1, beginning of verse 17. So he's talking about this list, and he says, thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So he broke up these list of names into groups, into an outline, where he said the first chunk of names, Abraham, who God called out of an idol-worshiping nation and said, I'm going to take you to a land that I'll show you, and in that land I will give you my promise. I will bless you in that space, that geographical space. I will bless you. So he takes Abraham to that land. Abraham actually never owns a piece of that land. The only piece he owns was the funeral plot he bought for his wife and him to be buried in. He never ever possessed it, but he moved there on the promise of what God would give him. Abraham all the way to David. During that time, those 14 generations, Israel was enslaved for 400 years in Egypt. They came out and went through the Red Sea. They actually had these incredible battles, and they ended up in the promised land because God said, in that land, he said, flowing with milk and honey is where I will show up for you. Literally, they had a tent that they would set up every time they camped, and in that tent, God would dwell. And they would know it because he would be there, and the cloud would rest above it. They understand God's presence was with them. And once they landed in the promised land, that's where God's presence would exist. But then, in the time from David to the exile, 14 generations, though the temple was built and God was housed in the temple, it was a series of kings who were disobedient and took the nation farther and farther away from worshiping the true God. And in that time frame, they went into exile. But God promised them in Jeremiah, as they went into exile, that I have plans that are going to be able to benefit you. I'm going with you, even in that place. And we saw that in our study of Daniel, how even in the farthest reaches of where they could be scattered among other nations that obviously didn't worship God, God showed up. He was with them. He was present, and he delivered them in amazing ways during their time in exile. And at the end, there's 14 generations from exile to Jesus. And during that time, God was still present with his people because there were kings that were born in the line of Jesus while they were in exile. And ultimately, some of those kings brought the remnant of the people back to Israel. And as they came back into the city, you have to know Jerusalem was built up on a hill. And so whenever the people would come back to Jerusalem, the first thing they would see is they would see the temple up on the hill. It was an amazing building. The temple that Solomon built, it was covered with gold so that when the sun hit it, it would shine light throughout the whole valley. So as they walked back into their city, the first thing they would have noticed is on the top of this mountain, there was no temple. There was no reflection of God's presence in their life. There was nothing. And so as they came back in, the very first thing they built was the temple foundation. So they laid the foundation, literally laid concrete out. And then as soon as the concrete was laid out, they had an incredible worship service. And everyone lined the concrete foundation to the temple. But it wasn't even half the size of the previous temple. It was so much smaller. And so the group of people who had been there and were older, who had seen the previous temple, as they stood around this new temple, they wept. And the younger people who stood around the temple that had just laid this foundation, who had never seen the previous temple, who never had a place to worship God, they celebrated. And it said that from a distance, all you could hear was the sound of worship. Though it was lament and it was praise, it still sounded like worship because that's the truth. When God moves with us through times and seasons, there are seasons of worship that hold grief and lament, and there are seasons of worship that hold joy and praise. But they all sound like worship because God is faithful to be with us in those times. He came near, which means he was present, even when there was not a place for him to dwell. And ultimately, this side of the cross, as we stand in history, we've talked about that a lot through the book of Daniel. We stand in history to recognize the past, but we also recognize there's a future prophecy. And we don't stand where Daniel stood, we're a few inches over. So we get to know what it looked like to celebrate Jesus' birth. We get to understand the big picture, the mystery of the gospel, where he died for our sins. But we still have a future, which creates hope in us. But we also have a God who came near, and he did it in a timely way. God not only worked through people and was present with them, he's not only present in times, but he's present in events. Look at verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home to be your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him to do, and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. So God is present with the people, improbable as they are in the list of Christ. He is present in the events to bring them to a place and time that is perfect. Jesus came at a time when it was unique in history. The Greeks had ruled the world and had a written language that had never been before in the history of the world, where one language was read by everyone in the known world. The Romans had taken over just before Jesus was born, and they had built what's called Roman roads. They were the most engineering nation at that time, and they built roads throughout the known world. So there was one language, and there were roads to take the truth. And Jesus came right at that time so that he would make sure his gospel could be spread. And it could end up in Monrovia at 11 o'clock service in December, 22 shopping days till Christmas. Sorry. God has purposes in times, and he has purposes for people. Even though it was absolutely an impossible set of circumstances Joseph found himself in. Engaged to a woman to be married, finding out she's pregnant. And it said right away that he was respectful of the law, and so he could have had her stoned, but instead he decided to honor her, divorce her quietly. But even in that moment, the angel is communicating something to Joseph that will be the case from the book of Acts on, which is Jesus came to fulfill the law. It's no longer about a list of rules. It is about your heart. Man, I would much rather have a list of rules than to have God have to have my whole heart. Just tell me the things I need to do to be good enough, and then let me have the rest. That's not what it's like anymore. And Joseph was the first person to demonstrate that. He was asked to do something impossible, to take this woman and be a father to God's son. If Joseph didn't do that, they wouldn't have even been in the right city. We would have never had a song, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," because they went there because of Joseph's family lineage. We wouldn't have had the star and the wise men on our nativity scenes. We wouldn't even have had nativity scenes. So my dog could pick up baby Jesus like he did last year and chew him up. Is that the worst? The prophecy in that is like unbelievable. So I just didn't go theological. I just got mad at him. We wouldn't have near what we understand if Joseph hadn't been immediately obedient to something impossible. But my favorite part in this whole passage is that one phrase that said all of these things took place so that we might know that we have Immanuel. God with us. God intended every one of those events, every single thing that happened for that purpose, that we would know God is here with us. When Matthew says, as the prophet said, that prophet was the one in Isaiah that told that king, those kings are going to be in the ground. No one will ever know their names, but I'll tell you who they will know: Jesus. They will know him because when he came, we proclaim joy, because he brought the good news that when he's here, we're okay. I studied counseling later in my life, so I spent my college years as an athlete, so my GPA was whatever was eligible to be on the court, to keep my scholarship. But when my triplets went to school, I went back and got my master's degree in marriage and family therapy. And it was nice because it was not nice that I had to pay for my education, but it's nice that it meant something more to me. And I was that annoying older lady in the class that would ask questions when everyone wanted to leave. But I actually paid attention. It was new. So I learned all these different theories, and I learned all these different techniques. It was really interesting, and I use them all the time here at counseling. But one of the techniques I learned was called solution-focused therapy, and in that, they have a technique called the miracle question. It's really fun. You ask someone, let's say there's a husband and wife in there, and this is totally hypothetical. There's no one I'm talking about right now, because that would be illegal. So there's a husband and wife, and let's say they're having trouble with their child. And so I say, okay, what if this miracle happens? You go to bed tonight, and this miracle happened, and your biggest problem, whatever you identify that is gone in the morning. You wake up, and it's gone. How would you act? What would be the first thing you would do? What would you say to each other? And you can see where that's going. Hypothetically, then you just walk through, well, what if my biggest problem wasn't really my biggest problem? What if I just behaved a little differently and began to understand how I could look at this situation differently? I love to apply that to the truth of our lives. Our biggest problem, friends, has been solved. Our biggest problem is our separation from God. We couldn't do anything about it, not a single thing. God came near. All of that happened so we would know our biggest problem has been solved. So the question is, how do we act? What would we say? If we really believed that was true, if we really had the freedom that we got out of our crib, who would know it next? And how would it change how you live your life? Because one of the chief ways people know who God is in our life is the way we act and behave. Where we go to when we are in joy and where we go to when we're grieving. One of my sons, Boone, when he was little, he would have like night terrors. Really, really terrible dreams. And in that, like when he's 2 and 3 years old, he used to run in my room. And he would go to my side of the bed, because mom's always going to be soft in those moments. And she's going to secretly love it. And so he'd get in my bed, and this one night I'll never forget, he's just like stiff and tense, and he is really nervous. And I said, Boone, it's okay, it's okay. And it's really dark in my room, and he grabs my face and he says, are you looking at me? I said, yeah, Boone, I'm looking at you. And he literally felt my face to see if my eyes were open. He goes, no, do you see me? And I said, yeah, I see you, son. He goes, can you watch for me while I sleep? It was just this beautiful picture of my son needing to feel safe, needing not just to be with me, but to know I was for him and I was with him. God is Immanuel. He is with us. He not only is present, but he is for us. And God, just unlike Boone's mother, doesn't ever need to sleep. His eyes are on the righteousness. His ear is attentive to their call. He is watching for you, but you have to decide if you're going to be near him. If you're going to run to him when life feels overwhelming, dark, scary. If he's going to be the one that you move towards and literally say, God, are you watching? Are your eyes open? Do you see what's going on here? Have you seen this? That's who he is. That's who he desires to be. And at Christmas, we have a unique opportunity not only to live that truth out, but to share it with others as we share that gift with them. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you are Immanuel, that of the many names that you have for yourself, you not only identify who you are, but you tell us who we are to you. And God, we're so grateful for that because we need to be reminded of that all the time. But I love that as we start Advent, we started with this premise, this foundation to know that you're with us. You're with us in fear. You're with us in hope. You're with us in joy. And God, you remind us daily that we matter to you. God, the biggest problem we have is that we and our sin have separated us from you, but you have come near to let us know that you loved us too much to allow that separation to exist. And God, I thank you that we're reminded uniquely at Christmas, but God, that you are with us every single day. So we're grateful, and we give you not only our lives, but we give you our worship this morning. In your name, amen.
You are here. You are holy.